In a podcast interview aired on June 3rd, 2019, almost exactly 1 year ago, a podcast that was recorded just prior to Memorial Day of 2019, author and researcher Douglas Valentine was being interviewed by podcast host Ricky Varandas of the Ripple Effect podcast. And he said,
there's still this pervading depression, this pervading disaffection with the system, that it doesn't work, that everything is broken, and it's just this constant battle. Well, all my work is designed to say that this is not a mistake, that we are being pit against each other by the people that run this country. And the reason that they are so effective is because they do everything in secret.
Douglas Valentine has done decades of research and interviewed hundreds of people, and he has a very good understanding of how things really work. And if he says that the pervading depression fostered among the people is not a mistake, that it is intentional and deliberate, that it is a statement from someone who's giving a very informed opinion, someone who's in a position to know what he's talking about. Later in that same podcast, he says,
and so I dedicated the next 40, 35 years of my life to trying to show people in some concrete way what it is that's guiding their lives towards this sort of self-destructive behaviors, which is what they are. They're inherently self-destructive behaviors. It's everywhere being bombarded with this commercialism that doesn't, that has this like devastating effect on our souls. And it enables the secret forces that dominate us to go out and channel all that anger that we have within us because we're not fulfilled and we're not connected. And to channel all that onto phony enemies like Iran or Iraq or Afghanistan, or any place that the United States ruling elite wants to conquer and steal their resources. So it's propagandizing us and controlling us in a million different ways so that we react and respond to all the ways that they want us to, which enables them to continue their aggression everywhere else.
what is Douglas Valentine talking about here? He's talking about trauma, deliberately inflicting trauma on men and women, even though he doesn't explicitly use that term here. This is an incredibly important subject. It's a subject that I talk about in my latest book, Myth and Trauma, which explores individual trauma and also societal trauma and the connection of this subject of trauma to the deliberate destruction of the understanding of the world's ancient myths and traditions, the ancient myths which were actually given to us as an antidote to trauma. Now, what Douglas Valentine says in the above passage, he says that men and women are deliberately traumatized, speaking here about men and women in the United States, in order to make them more willing enablers of the ruling elite who want to launch immoral wars of aggression against countries where those elites would like to steal the natural resources that have been given to the people of those nations. That is an incredibly important breakdown, and I believe it's 100% accurate. I didn't encounter this particular interview with Douglas Valentine until just yesterday afternoon, but I do quote Douglas Valentine in my latest book, and as he says in the quotation just cited, he's dedicated the past several decades of his life to exposing concrete evidence that men and women are being deliberately manipulated, propagandized, and traumatized by hidden forces acting against the interests of the majority and for the benefit of those who want to seize for themselves the natural resources given to all men and women. I would recommend that everyone find and listen to that entire podcast interview of Douglas Valentine on the Ripple Effect from 1 year ago this Memorial Day. Elsewhere in that interview, he talks about the importance of mourning for the loss of those who gave their lives in wartime, while at the same time not glorifying war and not glorifying the killing of enemies on the battlefield. And he talks about his own father's experiences in World War II and afterwards. And if you connect that discussion to the evidence that Douglas Valentine has documented that certain hidden forces are deliberately traumatizing the populace and deliberately using propaganda to create phony enemies in order to launch wars of aggression with the purpose of seizing the natural resources given to other nations around the world, you'll realize why this use of propaganda against the citizens and this deliberate inflicting of trauma has to end, and why it's so hideous, and why Douglas Valentine's work is so important, and why you should stop what you're doing and listen to that podcast interview and every other podcast interview with him that you can find, as well as read his books. And in light of that discussion, we who've been going through a lockdown for the past several weeks might ask ourselves if there seems to be any evidence of a deliberate and coordinated propaganda campaign in conjunction with this coronavirus pandemic. I'm not saying that the virus itself is not real and that it's not potentially deadly and that it doesn't have terrible effects on the human body, but I think we're all looking around and saying that something just doesn't add up at all about the massive and sudden campaign of propaganda and the accompanying push to shut down everyone's movements and force the closure of hundreds of thousands of businesses and all the other things that we've just witnessed over the past months. As I wrote in mid-March, I supported a temporary stay-at-home decision in order to protect the most vulnerable members of society, a decision which we were told was predicated on hospital capacity. But there's no way you can say that this is still about hospital capacity all these months later as we approach the end of May. And I also said at that time in March, if you want to force people to stay home, you need to provide immediate and real assistance to ensure that businesses don't need to close, go out of business, and that people don't need to lose their jobs, all of which could have easily been done, but it was not done. So there's clearly something more going on here. I don't think it's a stretch to argue that it involves deliberately scaring and, in fact, trying to terrify people in order to get them to do things that they wouldn't ordinarily do. And I believe there are many layers to this deliberate propaganda campaign and many goals that the forces that Douglas Valentine talks about are trying to accomplish. And so in light of that, I'd like to recommend everyone also become familiar with researcher Whitney Webb, whose work can be found at The Last American Vagabond, but she's also written for Mint Press and other organizations. So a good way to find her various articles is to use the website Muck Rack, where you can see a list of all her articles along with links. I'd like to call attention right now to this article she wrote, which was published on April 21st of 2020, April 21st, just a few weeks ago, on Mint Press, entitled Techno-Tyranny, How the U.S. National Security State is Using Coronavirus to Fulfill an Orwellian Vision. In that article, she points to a study dated all the way back in May 2019, a year ago. And this document was uncovered recently by a FOIA request, a Freedom of Information Act request. And you can read the whole thing by following a link in Whitney Webb's article. That document from May of 2019 is a presentation put together by a federally funded government organization called NSCAI, the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, or AI. The NSC, National Security Commission on AI, NSCAI. You can see the list of commissioners who make up this National Security Commission on AI and who are behind this May 2019 presentation on their website. And these are not lightweights in the world of tech. As Whitney Webb's insightful analysis reveals, That presentation from May of 2019 discusses the need for, quote, structural changes in the U.S. in order to keep the U.S. from falling behind China in the development of AI capabilities. The document frames this as a national security imperative. Whitney Webb points out that the presentation says that because China has so much more e-commerce than the U.S. does, their AI can analyze so much more data and can evolve much better and faster than the AI in the U.S. Even if the AI was invented here, because they're using so much more e-commerce, their AI is going to get smarter faster. Because in the US, people don't do nearly as much e-commerce. And they talk about this in this May 2019 presentation. And also, in the US, people still use more cash and more credit cards rather than just buying things directly through their mobile phone, where you can identify instantly through the web who's buying what. And they do that in China. And so this presentation talks about how that feeds into their AI, is going to make their AI get better faster. And she also points out that the presentation says that because China has so much more facial recognition deployed everywhere, their AI can get much better at doing facial recognition tasks. And therefore the US is at risk of being left behind. And so all of that in this NSC AI document is framed as a national security threat, because they argue that AI is a critical national security concern. That's their argument. Let's take a quick look at that document. Remember, this document was published in May of 2019. So the slides are numbered right here. You can see this is a FOIA request. This was released under a Freedom of Information Act request. And each slide has a number right down here. So let's take a look at slide 0550. Structural factors. It's arguing that China has structural factors that will help AI get better faster, because they have more mobile payment and more urban density and on-demand service adoption, and the government is supporting facial recognition deployment. Okay, that's slide 550. Let's take a look at slide 555. We risk being left out of the discussion if we don't keep up on AI applications in diplomacy. Let's look at slide 560. Real name verification in China. Real name verification. This creates a centralized identity layer, destroying the concept of anonymity on the internet. Every username can be traced back to a government ID. Let's go to slide 614. You can see this whole, you can follow this link to this entire presentation and read all the slides for yourself. Having streets carpeted with cameras is good infrastructure. Soon, municipalities will be able to make every infrastructure decision based on complete data of how every person is moving through the city in real time. It says real time right there. Complete data of how every person is moving through the city in real time. That's slide 614 from this presentation. They're not complaining about this. They're saying this is a structural advantage that's going to cause the U.S. to fall behind. So let's take a look at slide 620, AI and surveillance, government as an anchor customer. Slide 620 and following. In the US, AI is painted as something to be feared, but China views it as a tool and an opportunity. Surveillance is one of the first and best customers for AI. Convictions based on voice recognition of phone calls. Surveillance use cases have allowed China to leap ahead. Facial recognition could allow China to leap ahead in image recognition and biometrics. That's on slide 624. Look at slide 629. Even more significant in biology and healthcare. Wouldn't it be a surprise to see the Chinese government require every single citizen to have their DNA sequenced and stored in government databases, something nearly impossible to imagine in places as privacy conscious as the US and Europe. When I was in the Army, everybody gave their DNA. And you know how we did it? With a swab. They swabbed you and got your DNA. Almost impossible to imagine in places like the US and Europe. Not impossible to imagine 1 year later. Let's look at slide 631. Build a national facial database. The global balance of power is shifting. And they're arguing that the US is going to fall behind because of China's AI capabilities. Okay? So they're arguing that these structural changes are needed, or China has structural advantages, and they're recommending structural changes, although they're saying it's impossible to imagine them right now. Well, we can finish on this one. It's the natural consequence of structural conditions that exist within certain markets. So in Whitney Webb's article, she talks about how this document discussed in detail the structural changes that the American economy and society must undergo in order to ensure a technological advantage over China. Now, let's look at what this lockdown has done. It has driven massive increases in e-commerce and mobile purchases because you basically had no other choice in a lot of situations. I listened to the CEO of a major company this week say that, quote, in the last few months, e-commerce has gone from a growing channel to the only channel of operation for all age groups and genders. We expect this to have a long and lasting effect on consumers as they continue to embrace the flexibility and efficiency associated with this channel. By channel, he means a way of getting your merchandise, whether it's going into a store or buying it through your mobile device, etc. Those are different channels. And he's saying that for many goods, the only option suddenly became buying it electronically. And remember that when you buy electronically, then the data surrounding that purchase can now be analyzed by artificial intelligence, which is exactly what that May 2019 study was saying we needed more of so that we don't fall behind China in terms of AI evolution and advancement. That presentation said we needed, quote, structural changes in order to change the way men and women in the U.S. behave and think so that they'll adopt e-commerce and accept things like facial recognition, because if we don't, we're going to fall behind. Now, I'm not saying that those who wrote that study in May 2019 knew that the coronavirus was coming or that there was going to be this draconian lockdown, which was supported by an absolutely amazing coordinated media campaign designed to scare and even terrify the entire population. They might have known about it or they might not have. But it certainly seems that this very suspicious lockdown might well have had as one of its goals the engineering of major structural changes. Now let's listen to a clip from a corporate conference call that was live today. This is a conference call from today, May 21st, 2020, with the CEO of a corporation called NVIDIA. It's a major tech company with a market cap of over $215 billion, which means it's one of the largest companies in the United States. It's one of the largest companies in the world. And if you don't know, NVIDIA makes powerful graphics processor units, or GPUs. which are absolutely essential. They're microchips, they're processors. They're used. They're used for all kinds of applications, but they're absolutely essential for AI and machine learning. And here's what their CEO said today in response to a question from a Wall Street analyst regarding what might change due to this COVID lockdown that we've all been going through. Here's the question, and here's the response.
And then, Jensen, a bigger picture question for you, and really not specific to healthcare, more broad-based, but how do you think about the long-lasting impact of COVID on worldwide demand for AI? Thank you.
Yeah, CJ, thanks for the question. This pandemic is really quite tragic, and it's reshaping industries and markets. And I think it's going to be structural. I think it's going to remain. And I think your question is really good because now's a good time to think about where to double down. There's a few areas that I believe are going to be structurally changed, and I think that once I say it, it'll be very sensible. The first is that the world's enterprise digital transformation and moving to the cloud, that is going to accelerate. Every single company can't afford to rely just on on-prem IT. They have to be much more resilient. And having a hybrid cloud computing infrastructure is going to provide them the resilience they need. And so that's one. And when the world moves and accelerates into this $1 trillion IT infrastructure transformation, which is now $100 billion into that journey, it's growing 40% a year. I wouldn't be surprised to see that accelerate. And so cloud computing AI is going to accelerate because of that. The second is the importance of creating a computational defense system. The defense systems of most nations today are based on, radar, and yet in the future, our defense systems are going to detect things that are unseeable. It's going to be infectious disease, and I think every nation and government and scientific lab is now gearing up to think about what does it take to create a national defense system for each country that is based on computational methods. And NVIDIA is an accelerated computing company. We take something that otherwise would take a year. In the case of Oak Ridge, and they filtered 1 billion compounds in a day. And that's what you need to do. You need to find a way to have an accelerated computational defense system that allows you to find insight, detect early warning ASAP, and then of course that computational system has to go through the entire range from mitigation to containment to living with it and monitoring. And so scientific labs are going to be gearing up. National labs are going to be gearing up. The third part is AI and robotics. We're going to have the ability to be able to do our work remotely. NVIDIA has a lot of robots that are helping us in our labs, and without those robots helping us in our labs, we have a hard time getting our work done. And so we need to have remote autonomous capability to handle all of these either dangerous circumstances, to disinfect environments, to fumigate environments autonomously, to clean environments, to be able to interact with people where as little as possible in the event of an outbreak. All kinds of robotics applications are being dreamed up right now to help society forward in the case of another outbreak. And then lastly, I think more and more people are going to work permanently from home. There's a strong movement of companies that are going to support a larger percentage of people working from home. And when people work from home, it's going to clearly increase the single best home entertainment, which is video games. I think video games is going to represent a much larger segment of the overall entertainment budget of society. And so these are some of the trends I would say. I would say cloud computing, AI. I would say national labs, a computational defense system, robotics, and working from home are structural changes that are going to be here to stay. And these dynamics are really good for us.
Note that he said structural changes, and he related this to national defense. And he argues that AI is going to be critical to national defense. And there's very little doubt that these subjects are being talked about by major players in the tech industry. If you read the work of Yasha Levine, another extremely important researcher and the author of the book Surveillance Valley, you'll understand that the Silicon Valley tech industry is really part of the national defense industry, and it has been from the start. Now, I don't actually think there's anything wrong with NVIDIA or anybody else making GPUs. I don't think there's anything wrong with NVIDIA trying to make the very best GPUs in the world, which is what they do. In fact, their amazing GPUs can be used for all kinds of tremendously good applications to help the world, as well as to make movie magic and all kinds of other things, video games. They probably have nothing to do with the decision to lock down everybody in their house for months, forcing people to use e-commerce and forcing, quote, structural changes on society. But if someone is deliberately lying to people about a pandemic in order to engineer, quote, structural changes in society, with one of their goals being to greatly increase surveillance and the use of e-commerce so that someone can track your every move and your every purchase and obliterate your privacy, that is a clear and unequivocal violation of the Constitution of the United States and the Bill of Rights, which are innate human rights belonging to every single man and woman simply by virtue of their being born. Those are non-negotiable, innate, inalienable rights that nobody can take away. And the way to address this problem is through the people demanding that the Congress and the executive branch and the judicial branch of our government, a government which belongs to the people and not to the corporations, demand that those branches of the government not violate the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and not permit violations of people's innate, inalienable rights. Boycotting this or that corporation isn't going to do anything. It isn't going to get to the heart of the problem. The problem is the government of the people not doing its job. The government and all of its branches is only given power through the social contract for one purpose and one purpose only: to uphold the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. I was in the U.S. Army, and I had machine guns and all kinds of cool gear and weapons at my disposal when I was an infantry platoon leader in the 82nd Airborne Division and when I was a infantry company commander in the 4th Infantry Division. But I didn't get to just use those weapons however I wanted for whatever goal I wanted and use them however I pleased. I was given all that awesome firepower for one purpose and one purpose only: to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. So if you have a secret group running around putting out propaganda to scare the hell out of the people, to terrify the people in order to enact structural changes, in order to impose more surveillance and get more data for AI, that means that the legitimate government of the people are failing to do their job. They're failing to uphold the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and the people need to demand that they do so. We're in an extremely dangerous situation right now because propaganda and deliberately inflicting trauma are very powerful tools of oppression. And it's very clear that Douglas Valentine is correct in noting that they've been deliberately and systematically used for decades against the people of supposedly free countries. And the situation is much more dangerous than ever because a techno-tyranny today, with the technology we have today, would be much more dangerous and much more oppressive and much more intrusive than anything described in Orwell's book 1984. But the people actually have all the power in this situation if we wake up to what's going on and demand that the Constitution and the Bill of Rights be upheld. Corporations are under the control of the elected representatives of the people. Corporations have to get a corporate charter from the Secretary of State in the state in which they incorporate in exchange for the people give corporations certain rights like limited liability, but that is a conditional privilege that's given to them. They're given that in a corporate charter that's bestowed by the people through their representative, in this case the Secretary of State. That charter can be revoked if they are violating the Bill of Rights. In fact, it must be revoked if they do so. The problem is with the representatives of the people if they're not enforcing the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and if they're allowing or enabling violations of the Bill of Rights. Corporations should absolutely be allowed to make GPUs and write AI algorithms, but the government that belongs to the people can and must demand that those incredibly powerful tools only be used in accordance with the Bill of Rights and never in violation of the Bill of Rights, or that corporation can and must have its corporate charter pulled. We need to wake up to what's going on right away, or the world's going to be in a great deal more trouble than it already is.